My name is Roger Aden. I live in Athens, Ohio now and teach at Ohio University in the School of Communication Studies. But I am a Nebraska native and still consider myself a Nebraskan as a result of that. I grew up primarily in Scottsbluff, lived in Gearing as well for a few years in my very early years, but spent most of my time in the educational system in Scottsbluff, and then had the decision to make after I graduated from high school about where I would go to school. And I was leaning between the junior college in Scottsbluff, Nebraska Western College as it was called at that time, or the university in Lincoln, and I decided that it was time to spread my wings a little bit and move away from home. So I went to UNL in 1980, I started, and then managed to stumble my way into my current profession. As I finished my bachelor's degree, I realized that I really didn't want to pursue what I had been studying, and that was broadcast journalism. And so at that point, I managed to beg and plead my way into graduate school, and thanks to a very nice professor named Jack Kay, who managed to allow me to enroll in graduate school and find a spot in the graduate program in communication studies. And then I decided that after I finished that, I did not want to continue and become a professor, even though Jack Kay and a number of my other fellow graduate students were telling me, "Oh, you should get your PhD." And I said, "No, I have no desire to have a PhD." 3 months later, I called up Jack Kay again and said, "Is there any way?" And I found myself back in graduate school at the start of second semester, and finished up in 1989. So with one semester off, I spent the 1980s in school at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I've had a number of individuals who have been influential in my writing over the years. I've always loved to write as long as I can remember. When I was in high school, I wanted to be on the student newspaper and took a journalism class, and my teacher, Terry Pitkin, helped me become a better writer as a journalist. But I also had some help in my English classes. I had the very great fortune of having my mom's high school English teacher teach me composition as well, Ray Frakes. Mr. Frakes helped me realize that I still had a long way to go as a writer, because at that point you get to those teenage years and you start thinking you know quite a bit about what you're doing, and I realized I still needed to grow. And that was a valuable lesson that Mr. Frakes taught me. He was very kind about it, but it's helped me to this day remember that as a writer you are always growing, and you never have it figured out, and you can always improve. And he's been a big influence over the years in that respect. My wife, who is also a professor at Ohio University, Christina Beck, has been a more recent influence on my writing. I had been, most of the time, probably because of my journalism background, but I think to some extent because of my personality, a rather detached writer in terms of my style and approach, and she is a tremendous teller of stories in written form. She does academic work, but much of the time you wouldn't recognize some of it as academic work because they're such tremendous stories. She has a textbook where she opens each of her chapters with a narrative, and students respond so favorably to that. And so I have learned from her lesson to try to be more of a storyteller, even if I'm writing academic work. I still have a long ways to go in that respect too, I know, but it's helped me tremendously put a little bit more of me into what I write and tell a little bit more of a story when I'm writing as well. And both of them have influenced me a great deal. I think in terms of my influences about Nebraska and the Plains generally, I can't help but think that where you live, where you grow up, where you spend your formative years, it can't help but influence how you write and how you want to share your experiences and observations about the world and how we live in that world. And I think my time in Nebraska in particular really shaped me as a writer, even though I didn't realize it until I started writing the book Huskerville, maybe slightly before that, in some ways where I started becoming more interested in the idea of place, generally speaking. But I know now that that's my primary interest in terms of what I write, and I think growing up in Nebraska had a lot to do with that. It just took me a long time to realize it. I have strangely never thought of myself as a writer. I have always loved to write, but I've thought about that as part of what I do, no matter what it is that I do. For instance, when I was becoming, in my mind, a journalist, I went toward broadcast journalism rather than print journalism, where I would write less as a broadcast journalist than I would if I was a print journalist. And I'm still not entirely sure why that was the case. Maybe it was the idea of glamour in my mind that goes with broadcast journalism compared to print journalism. I'm not entirely sure. When I decided that I did want to get my doctorate, the fact that I could write as part of my job became a very important part of that consideration. I remember, in fact, sitting on a bench on Centennial Mall when I came to that decision and thinking, what do I want to do with my life? Because what I'm doing now is not it. And I realized that becoming a professor was what I wanted to do. And an important part of that was that I wanted to be able to write, which then made me think about my graduate work and where I wanted to teach afterwards, because unfortunately not every college teaching job is one in which you have the time allotted to you to write, because it takes time. It takes a lot of time, and more than anyone can possibly think unless they've gone through the experience of trying to find that time. And so I think writing is part of my job, but I've always thought of what I do as teaching primarily, and through the written word is some of where I teach. I had never thought about having a need to write, but I think that I do. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made the choices that I have made in my life about what I do and where I am going with what I do. I've always thought of it as a bonus to be able to write, but I can't fathom thinking about doing something as a career, or not, even if I had a different career, not having time outside of that career where I couldn't write. And I realized at that point that I do need to write to be able to be happy. And part of that is, I think, related to the fact that I'm a bit of an introvert, and so I don't express myself vocally that much. And so my means of expression is often through my writing more than my speaking. My students are always a little surprised when I'm teaching a public speaking class, and I tell them, look, I am an introvert, but if I can get up here and talk to you for this long and sound excited about it, surely you can do it for 5 to 10 minutes. And I tell them I am exhausted after I teach for an hour or two, because it's not in my character to be that outgoing and that verbal for that long of a period of time. On the other hand, I can sit down at my computer for hours and express myself that way. So I think the writing is a nice way for the introverted part of me to express myself in a comfortable way. And I think part of why I like to write too, and why I have something of a need to write, is that I have always been an analytical person, not necessarily an observant person. I used to think I was an observant person until I married my wife, and I learned what an observant person is, and she is definitely an observant person. And I realized the details that she would take in dwarfed what I took in. But instead, what I would do is focus on something in particular and sort through it. And writing becomes my way of sorting through it for myself primarily. It's a bit of a selfish exercise in that regard. But at the same time, once I've sorted through something and feel like I've figured something out, I feel selfish if I don't share that as well. So part of my writing is designed to help me work through puzzles about the world and how we interact with each other in the world for my own satisfaction, but then I also feel the need to share that with others. Whether they enjoy it or not, I have no idea some of the times, but I still feel compelled to make that observation public. When I started writing in, I guess, what I would call my journalistic days, I was more inspired by the idea of being able to concisely summarize something and to be efficient in that explanation. And not coincidentally, at that point in time, I was really drawn to the stories of Ernest Hemingway. And there is a writer who is very spare and economical in his language use as well. So I think I've had a bit of a influence in the way that I write and what I want to write about in that regard, but I'm certainly not at that point right now. I can go on and on rather than be concise. Sometimes I have to go edit myself when I'm writing in terms of length as opposed to needing to elaborate. The primary influence that I have with my writing and what I like to write about is this profound belief I have that where we are has such an influence on who we are. And where we are and who we're with has such a profound influence on how we interact with one another. And the idea of place and meaning drive everything that I write as an academic and have been for a little over 10 years now. I started initially wondering about the idea of place in popular culture narratives, whether they were television or film or to some lesser extent literature. I was interested in and struck by how strong of an influence the setting, whether it was a literal setting or a suggested or symbolic setting, had on the way that people approach the world and their interactions with others in the world. I did some writing in that regard for 5 to 6 years, and that led me to Huskerville, the book that I wrote about Nebraska and its inhabitants who are football fans as well, where I realized as I was living in Ohio 10 years after I had left Nebraska that I still thought of myself as a Nebraskan. I didn't think of myself as an Ohio resident. And I was that puzzled. That was one of those puzzles that hit me. Why is that? Why is it that I want to pay attention to what's happening in Nebraska? Why is it that I want to think of myself as a Nebraskan? And in pure sports terms, why I was still a Nebraska fan and not, say, an Ohio State fan. I started thinking about that, wondering about that, and I realized that where we are and where we have been have a strong influence on what we think of ourselves to be. In other words, place and identity are intimately related to one another, and I wanted to sort through that in more detail. I knew the answer, but I didn't know why that was the answer. And Huskerville was my way of getting there. And then wonderful experience I had researching and then writing that book helped reassure me that I wasn't the only person who was feeling strange, because I realized it wasn't a strange feeling. It was shared by hundreds of people who were living in Nebraska or living outside of Nebraska and who thought of Nebraska football not as merely a sport, but instead as a way to perpetuate their identity as Nebraskans. That being a fan of the football team, following the football team, cheering in particular ways as a fan of the football team was a way to continuously enact those things that were important to us as we developed our personality, as we developed our identity as individuals, and then just as importantly as we became aware of our identity as collective, that we were a group of people who thought much the same way. Now, I know many people who are not Nebraska football fans can have the same identity. In other words, we can value the same characteristics. We can think that those characteristics are important, and they can have absolutely no interest in football. But I think what makes the distinction blur a little bit is that if you ask those non-Nebraska football fans the same sorts of questions without football as a reference, you would get very similar answers to those who are football fans, because the football fans, of course, appreciate the winning that the football team has been associated with, but more than that, they appreciate the characteristics that the Nebraska football team in their mind, embodies that are truly Nebraskan. And they appreciate how they act as fans, individually and collectively, as an expression of something that is uniquely Nebraskan, so that they can see the team and themselves as distinct from other sports fans, other locations that are represented by sports teams. Even though we share a lot with other fans of other sports teams, there are particular things that we point to that say, here's what makes us Nebraskan rather than something else. The time that I write has varied over the years. When I was younger and without children, my best time for writing was very much late at night, early into the morning. My prime thinking and writing hours were often between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Now at 10 p.m. I am ready to sleep. So my window of writing time has shifted considerably over the years. Now I am best in the morning, and so I try to devote myself to writing in the morning, knowing that in the afternoon my brain is not going to be working in quite the same way, and in the evening hours my mind will be occupied with many other things, including who's going to have what for lunch tomorrow. I would like to think that I have a unique voice, but I don't think I do. And I think that's part of how I'm continuing to evolve with my writing. Part of that has been, I think, the type of writing that I do, which is primarily academic, has a long tradition of having a distant style where you couldn't necessarily recognize the voice of the writer. Increasingly, there is room for individuals to express themselves more personally and forcefully from their own point of view as academic writers. And I am increasingly moving in that direction, but I don't think that someone could point to something that I wrote and identify it as mine. Even among the few people in the academic world who are familiar with my writing, I don't know that they could identify it if they saw it, which I don't know that it bothers me a great deal that that's the case, but I also personally would like to think that what I have to say is unique enough that it could be recognizable. So that's one of the things I'm continuing to work with as a writer, to be able to do that. I can recognize my wife's writing, for instance, and know that's a story. She tells stories that way. I can recognize that story in the way that she writes it. And I'm still working in that regard, which is great for me to have an influence like that in the same house, because I'm always reminded I still have some room to go.
Okay. In terms of an audience, do you think generally you write for an audience?
I like to envision my audience as one that is educated but not necessarily college educated. Aware and intelligent is probably the way that I would write it, because I know that given my job, I have to write in a way that offers something that is unique and thoughtful and has some depth to it. That type of writing is hard to do and make accessible at the same time. And I've always struggled with that. I wrote a book before Huskerville called Popular Stories and Promised Lands, which was a much more analytical book in both tone and style. And as I wrote that, I had in mind, if I write this the way that I think I can write this, then my parents, neither of whom had a college degree, would be able to read this, understand it, and appreciate it. And that was my goal as my audience. I thought everyone in my parents' position should be able to read and enjoy this. I was, of course, a little disappointed after I gave my parents a copy of the book, and both of them responded with, well, this is really good. We skimmed a lot of it because we weren't quite sure what you were saying, but it's really good. We're really proud of you. And I realized at that point how far I had to go as a writer still to be able to write with and for the audience that I had in mind. I'm closer, but I'm still not there.
Okay.
My first piece of advice to anyone who wants to write and have that work be read by others is to write what you love. If you try to write something that you think others will find interesting and you don't find it interesting, they won't either. You have to write from your heart. Even as an academic, I try to do that. I don't pick topics to write about that I'm not really interested in. One of the things that I tell graduate students when I teach them is the great part about this job is that you get to study, research, and write about things that you find interesting. The challenging part of it is to get other people to think that they're just as interesting for them as it is for you. And that's a challenge I think that all writers face, no matter what kind of writer they might be, that you want to express yourself and be true to yourself as a writer, but at the same time be able to frame and phrase and capture those thoughts, experiences, observations in ways that other people can also appreciate them. Once you do that, the next part is probably a little bit easier, and that is the publishing part. There are so many publishers, there are so many people who have interest in all kinds of writing, that if you have really worked on your writing and you have expressed yourself in a true, thoughtful, and clear way, then you are going to have a better chance of finding someone who will publish your work. And anymore, I would also suggest the idea of self-publishing. Increasingly, that's a good possibility for people who have something to share where a publisher may not see a wide audience for it, but you may have a sufficiently wide audience that it's worth sharing. I ran into, when I first started writing Huskerville, a woman who was living in a retirement community in Arizona, who had sent me a very modest self-published collection of stories that she had written about growing up in the homestead era in western Nebraska. And those stories were marvelous. I can see why, if she had sought a publisher, that they wouldn't be published and widely distributed, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an audience for those stories who would appreciate them. At the very least, I know that her family certainly would appreciate those stories, and they would pass them on within their family. And I think especially as our technology develops and our electronic means of communication proliferate, that keeping stories within the family in some ways becomes harder and easier at the same time. And I hope that everyone who thinks about that possibility focuses on the easier part of it rather than the harder part of it. We can forget to ask about the stories that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have that are worth remembering. And if we forget to ask about it because we're so consumed with communicating in the present, then those stories are lost. One of the things that I am most happy that I thought of was to share with my mom a digital audio recorder so that she could visit with my grandmother and share those stories and memories that my grandmother had from when she was growing up. Now we have those preserved. We can share them with extended family. They can share them with their extended family, and those stories and experiences will last as long as we keep a hold of them. And I hope all of us can remember not to get too caught up in the moment and remember that where we are today matters, but it matters because of where we came from, and we have to remember where we came from through those stories in order to handle all of the uncertainties that are in front of us as well. I am doing something new. It's completely different for me. It's still an academic project. It's still involved with the idea of place and meaning, and it's entirely not Nebraskan. I stumbled onto, a number of years ago, the development of a new memorial sponsored by the National Park Service. In Independence National Historical Park, they discovered the site and the exact footprint of what they call the President's House, which is where Washington and Adams lived and resided as chief executives while Washington, D.C. was being built. A remarkable find right by the Liberty Bell Center. What became even more remarkable is that the historian who did the research to locate the footprint of the site, discovered that President Washington had brought slaves from Mount Vernon to work in the nation's first executive mansion in the free state of Philadelphia. Now, he could legally bring slaves to Philadelphia, but the state law in Pennsylvania said at the time that if an enslaved person lived in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months, they would be considered free. Washington was aware of that law, so he instructed his personal secretary to make sure that before 6 months was up, those slaves were taken back to Virginia for a day or across the river to New Jersey and then brought back so that they would remain enslaved. Washington also signed the Fugitive Slave Act in that home, and one of his slaves in Philadelphia escaped, and he went to great lengths to try to track her down and bring her back to Mount Vernon or Philadelphia. That story is one that's not widely told in the history books, that the father of our country, we knew, had slaves at Mount Vernon, that he was that intent on keeping those individuals enslaved and that he worked around state law to make sure that they remained enslaved, was a pretty compelling story as well. In fact, it overwhelmed the story of the fact that we had the President's House site definitively identified by its footprint. So after much political wrangling, they have finally constructed, 8 years after this discovery was published, an installation in Independence National Historical Park that marks the site of the President's House, but in terms of its interpretive content, focuses dramatically on the story of Washington's 9 slaves specifically, and the institution and practice of slavery generally. The site is the first, oddly enough, federal memorial devoted to slavery in the nation. And its location in Independence National Historical Park, right beside the Liberty Bell, just down the street from Independence Hall, is striking, to say the least. And so I'm now working on a project that hopefully will result in a book that looks at the development of that site and the experiences and reactions of the people who visit it as well, because I think those reactions and the story that goes behind it will speak a great deal to how we have seen ourselves historically, and the fact that as much as we like to think we're so much better right now, we still have a lot of struggles dealing with the legacy of slavery and race relations in the country. And I think this site promises to reveal much about things that we haven't wanted to talk about.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to do today?
Today I'll be talking about my book Huskerville. I'll be reading excerpts from it, relatively brief excerpts, because I want to provide a sense of the whole, because in my mind the entire book is part of a cohesive story that talks about the history of Nebraska, the cultural geography of Nebraska, and how those things that have shaped and formed what we consider ourselves to be as Nebraskans get represented in the University of Nebraska football team and the way that we cheer the team. So rather than reading one extended selection from the book, I'll be reading a few bits and pieces from the book, trying to give a flavor of the whole thing in the time that's available.
Okay, sounds good. Anything else that you need to?
I don't think so. I appreciate this opportunity. It's a marvelous experience, and I've enjoyed the interview, and I look forward very much to the reading as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Meredith McGowan, and I am the curator of the Heritage Room. And I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames reading series. We're very excited that this reading series has been in existence for more than 25 years, and that this is the 198th reading. Thanks for being here. We are here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors. It is a special collection that's dedicated to promoting and preserving works by and about Nebraska authors. It is a representative collection with about 13,000 volumes, written by more than 3,000 Nebraska authors. We also have information files, magazines, pictures, manuscripts, and if you look around the room, you'll see some artwork from various Nebraska authors as well, and portraits, etc. And I do want to let you know that the Heritage Room is not tax supported. It is supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, and we would like to thank the NLHA for the endowment that was established a number of years ago through their volunteer efforts. And we do invite you to visit the Heritage Room during our regular public service hours. We want you to know that we're open from Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3, and on Sunday from 2 to 5. And actually, we're open right now. We're having the Ames reading during our Sunday afternoon hours. So here we are. We do actually film the Ames readings, of course, on Channel 5 as well. I should say that Channel 5 films the readings. And for those of you who are not here in the Heritage Room now and are watching this on Channel 5, I want you to know that we're located on the 3rd floor of Bennett Martin Public Library at 14th and N Streets in downtown Lincoln, and that the Ames readings are currently held at 2 o'clock on the 3rd Sunday of the month. Our reader today, excuse me, is Roger Aden. Roger was born in Scottsbluff, but he's also lived in the Nebraska towns of Gering and Lincoln. He's received 3 degrees, all from UNL, and he earned his PhD in 1989. Roger has worked at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, I believe, and is currently at Ohio University in Athens. His writing includes nonfiction and academic writing. His popular stories and promised lands, fan cultures, and symbolic pilgrimages was published in 1999. And his most recent book, Huskerville, A Story of Nebraska Football, Fans, and the Power of Place, was published by McFarland Publishing in 2008. He does seem to be interested in fans, and I'm sure that he'll let us know why shortly. We're very happy to have Roger here with us today. Please help me welcome him.
I'm happy to be here as part of the Ames reading series, and I especially want to thank Meredith and John and Gloria Strope for doing their part to get me here. I haven't been to Lincoln since 1999 when I started doing research for Huskerville, and it's been a pleasure to be back. We've enjoyed, my daughter Emmy and I have enjoyed the weekend immensely, and John and Gloria Strope have been tremendous guests, and I'm very happy to be here today as part of the Ames reading series as well. I will be reading various excerpts from Huskerville to try to give a sense of the book's entirety. I'll begin by sharing a story about how I got started thinking about the book. This isn't the opening of the book, but appears in the introduction. After 5 years of living outside of Nebraska, I returned to Lincoln on Friday, October 28, 1994, to watch the Nebraska-Colorado game the next day. To be there, I got lucky. Back in August, one of my college roommates, Tony Korth, had snagged a ticket for me through a guy he worked with. When I arrived that Friday in October, the agent at the Alamo rental car agency told me that the tickets were being scalped for as much as $400, thanks to the buzz surrounding the 200th consecutive sellout of Memorial Stadium and the matchup between the number 2, Nebraska, and number 3, Colorado teams in the country. I also got lucky because my absence of 5 years made me more perceptive and observant about the things that I had taken for granted during the time that I was away. Despite being at home in Lincoln, I was also keenly aware that I was a Nebraskan who now lived outside of the state. I cherished the conversations with friends the night before the game as we ate pizza at Valentino's and had a bottle of Rolling Rock at O'Rourke's. I reveled in the euphoria of the game itself, especially the sight of a Husker player wearing the number 47 and the name Aden on the back of his jersey, my cousin Matt. I soaked up the family atmosphere after the game when I met with 3 sets of aunts and uncles, 2 cousins, a second cousin, and assorted significant others. At each stop, I gradually, if not consciously, realized that football, family, and home were somehow related to one another. My Aunt Kay, a resident of Colorado and Arizona for most of her adult life, helped crystallize what I was feeling. That Saturday, as we talked about the place that we both still considered home, she said, there's something about this place that sticks with you. The photos in my mental scrapbook from that weekend remain vivid, but most of all, I remember my Aunt Kay's words, for they triggered my reflections on home, disorientation, and what it means to be a Nebraskan. I realized that our homes are not just houses or even mere spots on a map, physical locations marked by welcome to and thanks for visiting. No, our homes are intertwined with our beings, burned deep into our souls, for better or worse, and they serve as lifelong companions to us to one degree or another. As Nebraskan Johnny Carson once noted, in a sense, we're like a turtle. We carry our home with us wherever we go. For Nebraska football fans, football is not just football. It's also about a way of being in the world. Nebraska football is how we experience, shape, and share our understanding of being a Nebraskan. That place that we all gather as football fans, I decided, was a place that I would call Huskerville. Now, Huskerville is like a lot of small towns in Nebraska. It's a place where neighbors know each other well, work hard at what we do, and try to remain not thinking of ourselves as better than other people. It's a place where local festivities bring people together to share and celebrate, rekindle ties, and draw attention to characteristics that might go unnoticed by those from bigger places. It's also a place where winds of change threaten long-held and valued traditions rooted in an agrarian way of life. From that observation that I made after visiting with my Aunt Kay and enjoying my visit back in time, those many years ago now, and from thinking after the fact, after talking to Huskerville fans around the country, throughout Nebraska, even a few of them around the globe, I settled on what I thought were the key characteristics that made Nebraskans Nebraskan. In other words, what about Nebraska football and being a Nebraska football fan made us distinct from other football fans, other fans of other sports and other places, for instance, because certainly fans are devoted to their teams all over the world, and we share much in common with those fans. But I realize that there's also something in each of those cases that makes those fans unique. That uniqueness, I think, is rooted in the experience of where one is located, the place one comes from, the place one calls home, and how being a fan of a particular team is a way of always enacting those ideas that are rooted in that place. And that's where I came up with the name Huskerville and the ideas that I think represent the essence of Huskerville as Nebraska football fans practice them. I want to talk about those ideas and give you a few brief excerpts from the book that highlight those ideas. But first, I want to touch upon something that I just concluded reading, and that was the idea of winds of change. Because I think in the case of Nebraska in particular, those winds of change make being a Nebraska fan and enacting those ideals of being a Nebraskan even more important. So one of the early chapters in the book talks about the idea of the possibility of being uprooted and what happens when one can be uprooted. From chapter 4, The Winds of Change and the Threat of Being Uprooted. Notes farmer and professor Victor Davis Hanson, there has not been a single month since the early 1950s when the number of genuine American farms has increased or even stayed the same. The erosion in the number of farmers across the nation, Hanson continues, has been so substantial that the Census Department announced over 2 decades ago that it would no longer count the number of American farmers. Hanson wrote, "Those still making a living by working and living on their own land were dubbed statistically insignificant." These changes aren't exactly new to Nebraskans. It all started during the Dust Bowl days of the 1930s. In 1935, the number of farms in Nebraska hit the historical peak of 133,616. Today, when I wrote Huskerville, only about 50,000 farms remain. 72 of the state's 93 counties reached their population peak in the 1930s or earlier. 40% today of the state's counties have less than half of their historical peak populations. While the state's overall population does continue to grow, Nebraska's rural population steadily declines. For example, the populations of Douglas, Sarpy, and Lancaster counties the main population centers for the Omaha and Lincoln areas, collectively grew by 160,000 people between 1980 and 2000. Yet, in 73 of the state's 93 counties, the population declined during those 2 decades. In many cases, these drops in population were significant. 56 counties had more than 10% migration between 1980 and 2000. Not surprisingly then, according to the 2002 Census of Agriculture, Nebraska lost 18,000 farms and nearly 270,000 acres of farmland between 1974 and 2002. If this trend is not reversed, warns John Ellen, a rural sociologist at the University of Nebraska's Institute for Agriculture and Natural Resources, many of our counties will consolidate, the rural life will fade away, young people will increasingly leave the state. Ellen's dire prediction omits what I think is the most frightening consequence of these developments. Nebraska's cultural identity will be shaken. The state is perplexingly at once becoming more urban and more desolate, and thus more disconnected from its traditional mooring in an agrarian lifestyle. The result, as a turn of the millennium story in the Grand Island Independent proclaimed, is simple. Nebraska faces identity crisis at start of 21st century. In that story, reporter Phil Rooney quotes Creighton University economics professor Ernie Goss, who says, "It's a transition period, really. We're now an urban state." In other words, all these numbers mean that Nebraskans fear losing a way of life that has provided a cultural identity, a sense of who we collectively have been, continue to be, and hope to be. As scholars who study the notion of collective memory emphasize, who we remember ourselves to be in many ways determines who we continue to be. In this respect, Huskerville is about remembering more than it is about nostalgia. Without relevant roots, we may blow about the cultural terrain aimlessly, like some kind of cultural tumbleweed. For fans of Nebraska football, strange as it might seem, this cultural erosion is, or can be, at least, resisted symbolically by becoming a fan and enacting one's identity as a fan of Nebraska football. Now, that struck me as odd at first when I started thinking about this book, but the more I thought about it, the more I talked to Nebraska fans, the more I listened to what they had to say, the more I realized that as a Nebraska football fan, what we are doing is continually reenacting those values that can be slipping away as the state's cultural identity shifts over time. The remainder of the book then focuses on what those characteristics are, how they're associated with Nebraska football, and how enacting them as a collective becomes important to us. I'd like to begin by talking about what I think is probably the most critical characteristic, and that is the idea of working hard, or a Nebraskan work ethic. From Chapter 6, Working Hard and Walking On. On January 1st, 1863, the first of what would be tens of thousands of Americans staked their claims for free land under the auspices of the Homestead Act of 1862. Called one of the truly epical laws of American history and a document celebrating its centennial anniversary, the Homestead Act offered 160 acres of free land to adults willing to live on and improve the land for 5 years. Upon completion of the 5 years, homesteaders were said to have proved up their claim. While the phrase proved up lacks grammatical elegance, it effectively captures the transformation from potential to success embodied in the idea of homesteading. As Victor Davis Hanson claims, farming involves deed, not mere word, reality over theory, substance over brag and big talk. For recent immigrants and those with relatives still living in Europe, the Homestead Act's opportunity to earn your land through what Nebraska folklore historian Roger Welsh called sweat and courage was a dream come true. Your bank account did not matter. Your family history did not matter. Your connections did not matter. The only thing that mattered was your willingness to work hard and persevere. That spirit is embraced even today. In the 2002 Nebraska Rural Poll, of almost 2/3 of the rural Nebraskans who responded believed that people like them were, quote, work-oriented, self-sufficient, and tough, resilient. Interestingly, farmers and ranchers seem to embrace many of the characteristics even more than other rural Nebraskans. The idea of working hard is represented in particular through the football program's walk-on program. The Huskerville work ethic is perhaps most apparent in those stories told about the University of Nebraska football team's legendary walk-on program. It recognizes that players without the exposure of playing in bigger cities and players who have yet to reach their potential may have something valuable to offer the team. It embraces the possibilities of transformation, believing that a young man who may not currently have the abilities of others has the potential to outplay others in the future if he works hard by being tough, determined, faithful, and patient. In many ways, then, the walk-on player is the contemporary manifestation of the homesteader. Just as the early homesteaders in Nebraska saw the possibilities for an agricultural haven in the midst of what others called the Great Desert, walk-on athletes do not see themselves as others see them. Instead, they see themselves as they can be. They believe that they can work harder than others and ultimately overcome others in competition, if they are willing, writes reporter Malcolm Moran in language that recalls the work of old Jules and other early homesteaders, to endure your years of unrewarded effort. The walk-on program stories are legion, and the book outlines a number of those, as well as the fans' preference for that program. And in fact, as I was writing this book, it was about the time that the previous football coach, Bill Callahan, scaled back the walk-on program. The resulting furor, I think, illustrated the importance of that program to Nebraskans' cultural identity and how it's manifested in the football program. One of the other primary characteristics of Nebraskans generally, and of Nebraska football fans in particular, is also the idea of being neighborly. That goes from applauding the other team as they leave the field to being kind to the fans of other teams as you see them on game day. The idea of being neighborly as well, I think, is rooted in Nebraska's cultural identity. I begin chapter 7, called Being Neighborly, with a story about coming to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for the first time. In August of 1980, I loaded up my 1970 Chevrolet Monte Carlo and began the 400-mile drive from Scottsbluff to Lincoln. The drive was made even longer by the fact that I was entering a different world. I was leaving a town of 15,000 people and moving to a university campus where the student population alone easily outnumbered the number of folks in my hometown. I was moving into a 10-story dormitory, a structure 3 times as tall as anything in my hometown. That was home to nearly 3 times as many students as I had in my entire high school class. I was feeling a bit overwhelmed. Then I met Danny Hayes. Danny was the first person I met as I hesitantly and cluelessly moved into my dorm room. He was ironing his clothes in an alcove and called out, "Hi," as I trudged past, looking for my room. He introduced himself, told me how to get a cart to carry my belongings, and warned me that I should move my car if I didn't want to get a parking ticket. Danny and I were from different worlds. He was from the big city of Omaha, and I was from the town of Scottsbluff. He was African American, and I am white. He was confident, and I was not. Yet he immediately helped me feel at home in my new, overwhelming environment. A large part of feeling at home, I know now, means that you know and have faith in your neighbors. Before I even opened the door to room 628 of Schramm Hall, I knew that I had a neighbor. In many ways, as I reflect, Danny was a lot like Mrs. Colopy, the man who lived with her husband next to my family on Avenue E, or the woman who lived with her husband next to my family on Avenue E in Scottsbluff. She welcomed us to the neighborhood, endured the frequent forays of my brother and I into her backyard to retrieve foul balls from our wiffle ball games, gladly purchased a few of our garden vegetables at the end of the summer, and every once in a while gave us a few extra pieces of candy when we stopped in the small store that she and her husband ran across the street from the neighborhood elementary school. I don't know that Danny Hayes and Mrs. Colopy were ever considered my friends, but they were considered something just as important, my neighbors. Neighbors are friendly, even if they aren't your friends. By their actions, which I talk about more in this chapter, they help us to become part of a collective. Both Danny and Mrs. Colopy have helped me to recognize another bedrock principle of Huskerville. We share the world with others. Not a terribly profound observation, I know. But when you grow up and live in places where not many of those others are near you, you can either become overwhelmed by the seeming emptiness of the area, or you can embrace your opportunities to be with others. This was especially important for the state's early homesteaders. As Mari Sandoz notes in Old Jules, Jules' dugout attracted more and more settlers, for news or to escape the need of having to live with themselves for an hour or so. One of the best stories of being neighborly that I discovered over the course of researching this book is related to my hosts for the weekend, John and Gloria Strope. As part of the research for this book, I asked friends to visit Nebraska watch parties across the country. One of my former students was living near Louisville at the time, and so she went to a Kentuckians for Nebraska watch party where John was host. She wrote back to me, "Everyone at the watch party was welcoming and kind to me and Brad. They bought us sodas, introduced us to the organization leaders, and announced our goals to the group. Not one person declined an interview, and several didn't wait for me to approach them. They embodied much of what they said about Nebraska people. They were definitely warm and friendly people. When I told John Strope that we were ready to leave, he again made an announcement to the group, and they all actually applauded as we left. My gosh, I've got to go to Nebraska." John and Gloria's neighborliness was on display again this weekend for my daughter Emmy and I. John arranged to get football tickets to yesterday's game, and the tickets were phenomenal. On the 50-yard line, in the West Stadium, 8 rows up, I felt like I was unworthy of the tickets. And then, as we were getting ready to go to the game, I asked John and Gloria where they were going to be sitting. And he said, "Oh, and our seat's in the South Stadium." And the thought then crossed my mind, he just got a pair of prime tickets to the football game, and instead of saying to Emmy and I, "Here are your tickets in the South end zone," and he and Gloria taking the prime tickets, the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he gave the prime tickets to Emmy and I. And I think that's, again, a wonderful example of Nebraska neighborliness and how we enact what we think is important as Nebraskans when we're associated with football. One of the other characteristics that's, I think, a key contributor to understanding who we are as Nebraskans and what we are in relation to one another is what I call the characteristic of being down to earth. This one was a little bit harder to put into words, and the idea of down to earth came about because so many of the people that I talked to or who shared stories with me used that phrase. Now, let me read from Chapter 8, Remaining Down to Earth, as I talk a little bit more about what that idea means. Being down to earth is appropriately rooted in the history of the state. From the Odo, Omaha, and Pawnee earth lodges to the homesteaders, dugouts, and soddies, Nebraska's residents have quite literally made their homes of the earth. As Mari Sandoz explains in her History of Nebraska, Love Song to the Plains, some homesteaders built dugouts under banks, while others carved blocks of earth and prairie grasses, stacked them on top of one another, and built sod houses. Even early schoolhouses in homesteaded areas were built of sod. This rooting of home to land and vice versa becomes even more profound when the homes are considered within the vastness that surrounded them. As miniatures within an immense horizon, these early homes, as well as the homes of farmers and ranchers today, seem to be the only thing that keeps people from being swallowed by the immense horizon, or perhaps blown away by a sweeping prairie gale. Willa Cather's description of the early homesteads in Nebraska in O Pioneers illustrates this relationship between home and land. The houses on the divide were small and were usually tucked away in low places. You did not see them until you came upon them directly. Most of them were built of the sod itself and were the only unescapable ground in another form. Perhaps this particular type of rootedness is what leads Cindy Lenz to describe Nebraskans as down-home, earthy people. There's a lot of farming community. Their roots are in the earth. They are just down-to-earth, friendly people, I think. The connections among earth, home, and the people who make their homes from and of the earth are, of course, manifest in the agricultural heritage of the state, as Cindy points out. Matt Ritter, who describes Nebraskans as very down-to-earth people, notes, "Both my dad and my grandfather were farmers, and I just really don't know that many other states are like that." Being down to earth, then, takes on additional meaning in Huskerville. Enacting your down-to-earthness sinks your roots into some powerful symbolic terrain. Being down to earth means being connected to the land in which you grew up, to a history in which homes were built from the land, and to families who made, and continue to make, their living from the land. As a result, being down to earth also provides Huskervillers with the symbolic material to distinguish ourselves from others who are not rooted in the land. As Stu Price of Louisville explains, while the rest of the country has shifted toward moral relativism, whatever feels good or is effective, do it, the family system in Nebraska remains rooted in belief in God, country, and family. Chalk this up to the agrarian nature of its people. Perhaps the best example of being down to earth is the current athletic director at the University of Nebraska, Tom Osborne, who was described by many people that I talked to as the epitome of a Nebraskan, especially in his down-to-earth demeanor. So I talk a little bit more in the rest of the chapter about what it means to be down to earth and how that's enacted in being a Husker football fan. And many of the people I talked to pointed to Tom Osborne's demeanor and approach as a way of enacting down to earth in their own lives. Now, the ideas of working hard, being neighborly, and remaining down to earth are those principles that individually we follow and collectively we subscribe to. The second half of the book talks about what happens when we get together and try to enact those principles as a collective or as a whole. One of the excerpts I would like to read for you now is from a later chapter in the book called A Big Red Presence Standing Out on the Map. And that collective nature of enacting those principles, I think, comes through pretty clearly in what some of the Husker fans told me in this chapter. Are we there yet? I asked my parents that question more times than I care to remember as we made the 350-mile drive from Scottsbluff to visit relatives in Hastings, Nebraska. Try as we might, my brother Chuck and I simply could not manage to entertain ourselves during the entire trip. Aside from a stop at Ogallala's Front Street, there was, to our young eyes, simply nothing to see along the vast stretches of U.S. Highway 26 and Interstate 80. My childhood experiences helped me to understand why people passing through Nebraska today think of the place as empty or boring. Or as Mari Sandoz once noted, Nebraska has been thought of as a long, flat state that sets between me and any place I want to go. Perhaps this is what non-Nebraskans think when they hear us say, "There's no place like Nebraska." These folks, to their detriment, make the mistake of thinking that open space is empty space. To this day, observes John Potter of the Nebraska State Historical Society, Nebraska suffers from a blank spot mentality to the rest of the world. We blame a lot of this blank spot mentality on Major Stephen H. Long. In 1820, Long returned from an expedition to the Rocky Mountains with a map labeling the part of the country that would become Nebraska the Great Desert. The label was found on maps for the next 50 years. In regard to this extensive section of country, Long wrote, I do not hesitate in giving the opinion that it is almost wholly unfit for cultivation, and of course uninhabitable by people depending upon agriculture for their subsistence. We've been fighting that perspective ever since, I think Major Long made his observation, so that when we succeed, and no matter what shape or form that might be, whether it's turning the state into an agricultural haven or becoming a football powerhouse, we are making a statement to the rest of the country that says, hey, there is something here. It's not a big empty space. Let me continue with that chapter. Husker football victories and the performances of the fans who support the team offer an irrefutable demonstration that the so-called Hicks right way of doing things, working hard, being neighborly, and remaining down to earth, is both effective and worthy of emulation. For better and worse, football is how we reveal our best stuff to the rest of the world. Huskerviller Beth Townsend notes, a knock against the Huskers is a knock against our way of life. To see the team perform well in any sport reminds us and the rest of the world that regardless of how old-fashioned our belief system might be, if you follow it, you will succeed in ways that you cannot imagine. The performances surrounding football games provide undeniable evidence that those who believe their ways to be superior are sadly mistaken. These rituals, in our eyes, correct the social order. Here, says E. Steve Cassells, is an empirical demonstration that we can stand in there with the best of them. We take more than a little guilty pleasure in providing these empirical demonstrations, too. It is so fun to be a fan of a team from a state with such a low population base that beats teams from more arrogant states every week, exclaims Scott Pagel from Taipei, Taiwan. Adds Pat Ferguson of Lakeland, Minnesota. We also use the Huskers as a means of recognition. We think that if we can have fewer than 2 million residents and still recruit players from all over, in addition to the homegrown players, and be competitive on a national level, well, we must be doing something right. These victories, as well as the performances of the fans, send the cultural message that Nebraska should be noticed, not overlooked. When people remember Nebraska, no matter what the score, Huskervillers have effectively provided a counterstatement to the blank spot, nothing there mentality. The Cornhusker football team, writes Tim Hindman, is evidence that there is more to Nebraska than what can be seen from the interstate. The Huskers, continues Kansas-based Gary McGurr, put Nebraska and UNL on the map. Gary's words are echoed by former Nebraska player Mike Barron, who played for Bob Devaney's teams in 1971 and 1972. He explains, Devaney put the state on the map. I can still remember going to the Washington, D.C. area in 1963 to see some of my cousins back there. And they seriously still thought that we fought the Indians and still rode around in covered wagons. That was the East Coast's view of Nebraska. Now, however, Nebraskans believe that the Huskers have generated respect for the state of Nebraska. In fact, 83% of those polled in a Scripps Survey Research Center survey completed for this book, including non-fans, said so. When we collectively put the state on the map, we also collectively put ourselves together. No matter where we live, no matter how we live, we think of ourselves as connected to one another in what I call a small world. Well, let me now turn to chapter 12, called It's a Small Husker World. In many ways, I should say this is my favorite chapter in the book because the stories in here are amazing, of people finding other Nebraskans in other ways, shapes, and forms that they can't possibly think would happen. But time after time, it happens to be the case. I'll begin with my experience with a small Nebraska world. Thursday night, October 7, 1999, I'm on the phone in the Nebraska Union. My wife, Christy, can't believe what she just heard. She said that she had just called the travel lodge in Lincoln where I told her I would be staying. She asked to be connected to my room, but another man answered the phone. Roger? She asked. Yes. Roger Aden? That's me. But it wasn't me. Turns out 2 guys with the name of Roger Aden were staying in the same Lincoln motel. Now, what are the odds? Well, in Huskerville, the odds are pretty good because it's a small world. I asked Christy where the other guy lives, and she had to compare addresses with the desk clerk to figure out who her Roger Aden was, but she can't remember. Gothenburg? I asked. That's it, she said. I explained about my trip to Gothenburg in high school and how, as I tended to do then, I was a bit of an oddball. Not that I'm not now, right? I looked in the phone book to see if any Adens were listed. To my surprise, I counted something like 17 Adens in the Gothenburg phone book. Now, for non-Nebraskans, Gothenburg holds just over 3,000 people. None of the Nebraska Adens in Gothenburg I'm directly related to. Now, earlier that night, before I had talked to Christy, a Nebraska student named Emily Wolgon had told me, life is a small world, they say. And here in Nebraska, I don't know, it's just an even smaller world. She's right, as I learned over and over again after that night in Lincoln. When we out-of-state Nebraskans see signs indicating the presence of another Huskerviller, we often react with a kind of excitement. Our almost reflexive response, even among introverts like myself, is something along the lines of, I'm from Nebraska too! Or if we're playing it closer to the vest, are you from Nebraska? Fortunately, most of these exchanges do not happen on interstate highways, as they sometimes do in other stories reported earlier in the chapter. My friend and colleague, Alina Amato Ruggiero, for instance, decided to blend into the Kentuckiana Huskers watch party that she attended by wearing a red sweater, which, she told me, turned into an invitation to every single person there to ask me, are you from Nebraska? After this opening question and the usual exchanges, we then talk like third cousins at a family reunion, exchanging hometowns to see where connections take us. Elena reports that after she explained her connection to me and that she was in Louisville to collect interviews on my behalf, the Kentuckiana Huskers then wanted to know what part of Nebraska you were from. When we meet someone and find out they are also from Nebraska, Carrie Ann Kluge of Louisville explains, you can ask them their hometown and chances are they will know someone you know from their hometown. Therefore, the state is like one huge community. Matthew Groves illustrates how this process works. It was after the 1996 season during the winter, and I had my Nebraska sweatshirt on. I was working down in eastern North Carolina as an engineer. I was having lunch with a friend and mentor of mine when a Marine Corps colonel walks past me and goes, "Grand Island." Without blinking, I said, "Bellevue." We proceeded to talk about our hometowns and the Huskers, the season, the surprising loss to Texas in the Big 12 championship, the latest recruiting class, and the outlook for the 1997 season. For about 15 minutes, like old friends. My friend sat there with his mouth open the whole time. Afterwards, he asked, "Did you know him?" I said, "Nope, never saw him before in my life." Exchanging hometowns is a vital part of these interactions because since darn near every town in Nebraska is a small town, chances are pretty good that we'll know someone that they know. When you're raised in a state with that small of a population, says Brian Winkle of Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, it seems like everybody knows everybody else. That knowing everybody else ultimately provides us with a sense of comfort and security. At the end of the chapter, I talked about that idea of security in a little bit more detail. Home, writes geographer Edward Ralph, provides us a secure point from which to look out on the world, a firm grasp of one's own position in the order of things, and a significant spiritual and psychological attachment to somewhere in particular. Such attachments are not to be taken lightly. They are profound connections. They provide a particular kind of security, not just an "I feel safe" or "I feel comfortable here" type of security. No, they offer us something vital to human existence, something that philosophers and social critics such as Anthony Giddens refer to as ontological security. This is the feeling that our very being, the essence of who we are, is safe and secure in a particular place. A stable sense of self-identity, writes Giddens, is at the core of ontological security. This identity, moreover, depends primarily upon our capacity to keep a particular narrative going. Huskerville offers a place where that narrative, the agrarian narrative, continues. That is undoubtedly why a fight song with corny lyrics written in the 1930s about fair weather and sticking together still resonates among Huskervillers today. Ontological security, continues Giddens, is an antidote for anxiety. While he writes of a more general existential kind of anxiety, we experience it in specific forms when we move away from home, feel time pass by too quickly, and notice things just aren't the way they used to be. In general, when we feel cultural forces pulling up our roots. Thus, when social and economic changes threaten to uproot Nebraska's agricultural traditions, we need Huskerville to remind us of what Nebraska means. When every town in the country with more than 10,000 people has a Walmart and McDonald's, and starts to look like every other town in the country with more than 10,000 people, we need Huskerville to remind us that we have a unique heritage. This isn't anything new. Writer Louise Erdrich notes that Willa Cather's novels about Nebraska's homesteads are elegies to the vanishing virtues, which she links with an unmechanized and pastoral vision of agriculture. It also isn't anything specifically unique to Nebraska, of course. But precisely because these forces of uprooting are relentless and pervasive, we embrace the security afforded by Huskerville. The concluding chapter of the book raises some larger questions about being a Nebraska football fan, as well as the power of place for identity. I'd like to read just a little bit from the concluding chapter about those larger issues as I wrap up today's presentation. When I first began thinking about this book, I was more than a little confused. I was struggling to come up with answers to several interrelated questions. Why did I still feel like a Nebraskan a decade after leaving the state? Why did something like Husker football mean so much to me? Why does it mean so much to other Nebraskans? Why did the idea of being a Nebraskan seem so tied to Husker football? And most important, why couldn't I, an introspective, educated person, explain the pull of Husker football when asked to explain its uniqueness compared with other team-fan relationships? Thankfully, my neighbors in Huskerville have helped me sort through these questions. Their insights, offered generously and almost entirely without condition, led me to identify how the rooting process works as an anchor for our cultural identity, how being a Husker fan is a means of collectively and continuously enacting the values of the Nebraska homesteaders, and how coming together in the contemporary equivalent of corn huskings puts the small, unique world of Huskerville on the map. At the same time, our conversations, as well as the comments of non-Nebraskans who have read drafts of this book, have raised a new set of questions for me. Would we embrace the football program with such fervor if it was not, as some have said, the only game in town? Even more technically desolate states have two major state universities and thus potentially divided loyalties among their citizenry. Would we be so passionate about a team that won a lot of games but didn't seem to reflect our values? More specifically, how would we respond to a national championship contending team that ran the West Coast offense, had few Nebraskans on its roster, and seemed to treat the victory as more important than the game? Or, conversely, what would we say and do if a team lost a lot of games while seemingly reflecting our values? Does our reaction to recent seasons of 5-6 and 7-7 say more about us or more about the different people involved with the football program during those seasons? Here's what I believe. Winning helps, as does being the only game in town. Without them, we might struggle to find such a powerful and comprehensive unifying experience, although undoubtedly we would, and arguably should, find additional opportunities for community experiences. At the same time, the success and prominence of the football program has provided us with an unparalleled opportunity to publicly and collectively enact and celebrate ideals which might otherwise remain beneath the surface. Today, we can't control socioeconomic forces that are depopulating rural Nebraska, and we can't control what the Husker coaches and players do on the field. But we work hard to keep alive the way of life that has been enacted in the fields and on the field. This struggle is in many ways unique to Nebraskans, but it is also one that in other ways reflects an ongoing struggle of all human beings, the desire to dwell in meaningful places and to act with integrity. So as we act, we continue to keep these dwelling places alive and vibrant. Rather than thinking of imagined communities like Huskerville, or incorporated communities like Scottsbluff, my hometown, as static entities, we should remember that communities are living creatures nurtured and nourished by rhetorical discourse. In particular, we tend to our communities by telling stories about them. For a place without a story is really nowhere at all. The story of Huskerville told within these pages points out how Nebraskans nourish, nurture, and tend our sense of place by rooting it in a collective memory, defining it through enactment of homesteader ideals, and maintaining it through ritual performances of contemporary corn husking. You see, we're still doing agricultural work. It's not only or just symbolic work, it's meaningful, purposeful work that helps us stay rooted, even if the winds of change raise new questions for us to consider. This story of Huskerville illustrates that, to borrow from the late Sue Rosowski, an expert on the literature of Willa Cather, a sense of place can serve as an anecdote, reminding us that a sense of place is not a lesson to be learned and set aside, but a habit that will support a lifetime. Thank you very much.